They survived ice ages. They buried their dead with flowers. They built shelters, tended fires, carved symbols into cave walls, and walked this planet for more than 300,000 years. And then, around 40,000 years ago, they vanished. Almost completely, not by war, not by disaster. Not in a single event, as far as anyone can reconstruct. The Neanderthals simply thinned out, generation by generation, until only a handful of isolated populations remained. Then none. What killed them has been one of the great unsolved questions of human prehistory. But according to recent analyses in which AI models have been turned loose on the most complete Neanderthal genomes ever sequenced, the answer may have been sitting inside their DNA all along. And if the interpretations are correct, the signal those genomes carry is not a curiosity. It is something closer to a warning. This is a story about genetics, artificial intelligence, and the uncomfortable possibility that a species that died out 40,000 years ago may have left us a message we are only now able to read. To understand why this matters, it helps to start with what the old picture looked like. For most of the 20th century, Neanderthals were treated as brutish failures, our slower, weaker, less clever cousins. A species that evolved in the cold forests of Eurasia, hit a dead end, and were outcompeted by our own smarter ancestors when modern humans spread out of Africa. That story was simple. It was also, we now know, mostly wrong. Beginning in the 1990s, and accelerating dramatically after 2010 when the first Neanderthal genome was sequenced from a fossil bone by a team led by Svante Pääbo, the picture started to flip. It turned out that Neanderthals had brains at least as large as ours, sometimes larger. They had control of fire. They made complex stone tools. They used pigments. They interbred with modern humans extensively enough that most living non-African people today carry somewhere between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA in their own genomes. That Neanderthal DNA is not junk. It codes for real functions: immune response, skin pigmentation, hair texture, susceptibility to certain diseases. Even, in some studies, aspects of how we process pain and how we sleep. In other words, they are not truly extinct. Pieces of them are walking around in the bodies of nearly 5 billion living humans today. That alone is a remarkable scientific overhaul. But the more interesting question, and the one that has dragged artificial intelligence into the story, is this. What did the full Neanderthal genome encode before it was scattered and diluted into us? What were they really? And why did they disappear? Until very recently, the second question was almost impossible to answer. Ancient DNA is fragile. It breaks into tiny pieces. It is contaminated with microbial DNA, plant DNA, from the researchers handling the samples. Extracting a full genome from a 50,000-year-old bone is a feat of technological patience. But by around 2020, techniques had improved enough that multiple complete, high-quality Neanderthal genomes became available for analysis. And that gave computational biologists something to actually work with. The problem was scale. A single human genome contains about 3 billion base pairs. A single Neanderthal genome contains roughly the same. Comparing them by hand, variant by variant, would take a team of researchers' lifetimes to complete. Which is where modern machine learning entered the picture. Deep learning models, especially large language models adapted for genomic sequences, have turned out to be extraordinarily good at finding patterns in long chains of data. Apply them to DNA and they can detect functional regions, regulatory elements, and statistical anomalies that traditional methods would have missed entirely. According to recent work from several genomics institutes, AI analysis of Neanderthal genomes has turned up patterns that do more than reconstruct the past. They reveal something structural, something that, in the language being used by some of the researchers involved, looks like a record of the specific pressures that drove Neanderthals toward extinction. It helps to understand, briefly, what the AI is actually doing when it analyzes a genome. Traditional genomic analysis treats DNA as a long string of 4 letters, A, T, G, and C, and looks for specific mutations or differences between sequences. The newer approach, inspired by techniques used in natural language processing, treats the genome more like a text written in an unknown dialect. The model learns the statistical rules of that dialect by processing enormous amounts of genomic data. Once it has learned those rules, it can spot passages that deviate from them. Passages that carry unusual information. passages that appear to have been shaped over time by specific selective pressures. This is different from pointing at a single mutation. It is more like noticing that an entire chapter of a novel has been rewritten under duress, while the chapters around it have not. The pattern emerges not from a single gene, but from the relationships between many genes across the entire genome. The headline claim, and the one that has given this story its viral edge, is that the AI has found a set of genomic signatures in the Neanderthal record that closely mirror conditions we ourselves are now beginning to encounter. A kind of biological echo. A pattern that, read carefully, could be interpreted as a warning. Before going further, the skeptical framing has to be placed front and center, because claims about ancient warnings and hidden messages are exactly the kind of claims that should be treated with care. Dr. Pontus Skoglund, a population geneticist at the Francis Crick Institute, has been one of the voices cautioning against overinterpretation of AI genomic results. His argument, in essence, is that genomes do not contain messages. They contain adaptations. They record the pressures an organism faced while alive. Talking about DNA as if it were leaving warnings is metaphor. A useful one, maybe, but a metaphor, not a literal fact. Any interpretation has to be grounded in what selection, drift, and population dynamics actually do. That is a fair point, and it is the correct scientific framing. With that qualification on the table, what is the pattern? And why has it raised the concerns it has raised? According to the relevant analyses, several features of the Neanderthal genome appear to show unusually strong signatures of what is called purifying selection under environmental stress. Specifically, genes related to immune function, thermal regulation, and fertility show patterns suggesting that Neanderthal populations were being repeatedly squeezed by pathogens they could not easily fight, climate shifts they could not easily adapt to, and reproductive pressures they could not easily overcome. These signatures become more pronounced in later Neanderthal genomes, the ones from closer to the time of extinction than in earlier samples, which fits a story in which the species was not killed in a single event, but slowly worn down by a combination of biological stressors operating over thousands of generations. The AI analysis also reportedly identifies specific pathogens inferred from ancient immune gene variants that appear to have been circulating in late Neanderthal populations. Some of these pathogens look structurally like close relatives of pathogens that are familiar to us today. Respiratory viruses, gut bacteria, parasitic organisms that affect fertility. The pressures Neanderthals faced were not, in many cases, exotic. They were recognizable. And that is where the warning framing has come in. If Neanderthals were gradually ground down by a combination of endemic pathogens, shifting climates, and reproductive challenges, and if the DNA record shows that pattern clearly, then the story of their extinction is not an ancient curiosity, it is a case study. A case study of what happens when a large-brained, culturally sophisticated, technologically capable hominid species runs into a wall made of biology and environment rather than warfare or predators. We are, of course, a large-brained, culturally sophisticated, technologically capable hominid species. The parallels are not exact, obviously. We have access to medicine, sanitation, agriculture, and global communication that Neanderthals never had. We have a population in the billions rather than the tens of thousands. We have technological tools that have pushed back the pressures of climate and disease in ways that would have seemed miraculous 40,000 years ago. But the structural similarities are there, and some of them are uncomfortable. Consider climate. Neanderthals lived through multiple glacial cycles, and the DNA record shows that each cycle left deep marks on their immune and metabolic genes. Their bodies were, in some sense, being rewritten by climate stress. We are now in the middle of a human-driven climate shift of our own, and while our technology offers buffers, our biology is still on the same slow clock as theirs. Adaptation takes generations. Climate change is not waiting that long. Consider pathogens. Late Neanderthals appear to have been hit hard by a wave of novel diseases, probably as their range contracted and they came into closer contact with each other, with other hominids and with animal populations carrying new microbes. The global situation today, with dense urbanization, industrial animal agriculture, and rapid international travel, is almost designed to accelerate the emergence and spread of novel pathogens. We have seen previews of that in recent pandemics. The AI analysis of Neanderthal genomes suggests those pressures can, over enough time, erode a population even when every individual generation seems fine. Consider fertility. One of the more striking findings reported in the recent work is that Neanderthal fertility genes show signs of long-term decline, particularly in the final millennia before their disappearance. Small, isolated populations, combined with possible fertility issues related to hybridization, with modern humans, appear to have compressed effective population sizes to the point where extinction became almost inevitable. Modern human populations are beginning to see their own fertility patterns shift for a complex mix of social, economic, and biological reasons. The parallel is not a prediction, but it is a reminder that the machinery that decides whether a species continues or ends can be quieter and slower than we usually imagine. Consider social structure. The Neanderthal genome, as the AI analyses suggest, carries signatures of high inbreeding in its final stages. Estimated effective population sizes for late Neanderthal groups may have dropped below a few thousand individuals across all of Europe and Western Asia. At that level, genetic diversity collapses, harmful mutations accumulate, and the population loses the ability to absorb new stressors. The whole system becomes fragile. And fragility, in a biological sense, is not dramatic. It does not announce itself with trumpets. It shows up as fewer births, slightly shorter lifespans, slightly weaker immune responses, and a slow compounding of small disadvantages. The species did not fall. It simply stopped recovering from ordinary setbacks. Modern humans in those places are not facing that specific kind of fragility. But in certain isolated populations, and in certain narrow genetic lineages, patterns of reduced diversity are measurable. The AI analyses of Neanderthal DNA are not the only context for thinking about this. But they are a reminder that the warning signs, once they begin to appear, can be missed until the damage is already advanced. None of this is an argument that we are about to go extinct. The differences between our situation and the Neanderthals are enormous, and many of them are in our favor. But the AI analysis, taken as a whole, is being read by some researchers as a kind of case study in how an intelligent, tool-using hominid species can be worn down to nothing over a long enough time frame. The Neanderthals in this reading are not a failure. They are a warning label. A reminder that the default path for a species, even a smart one, is not survival. It is extinction. The skeptical pushback here is important. Critics point out that any pattern the AI finds is inevitably shaped by the questions researchers ask. If you look for signs of environmental stress, you will find them, because every population is under some environmental stress. The signatures interpreted as warnings are also compatible with much more ordinary explanations. Slow demographic decline, genetic drift in small populations, ordinary evolutionary bad luck. Most mainstream paleogeneticists, while acknowledging the elegance of the AI analyses, tend to prefer multi-factor explanations without framing the Neanderthals as intentional messengers of any kind. That is a real disagreement, and it is an honest one. The data may genuinely support several interpretations, which is why the story is worth watching rather than acting on. Now step back, consider the wider picture. On a technical level, the use of AI to analyze ancient genomes is opening up a new field. Paleogenomics was once limited by how much information human researchers could extract from fragmented, degraded samples. Now, with models capable of processing billions of base pairs, we can ask questions about ancient populations that were unanswerable 5 years ago. Not just about Neanderthals. About Denisovans, whose fossil record is much thinner, but whose genome has now been sequenced from a single finger bone. About earlier hominid species, some of them known only from tiny fragments of material. About the wider story of human origins, which is growing more layered and more complicated with every new analysis. On a historical level, this changes how we think about extinction itself. For most of modern history, extinction was treated as a mostly external event. Something that happens to a species. Asteroids, volcanoes, ice ages, predators. The AI-driven view of the Neanderthal record points toward a more internal story. Extinction as a slow drift, a gradual loss of resilience, a failure to keep pace with biological and environmental change. That is a more unsettling model because it is less dramatic. There is no single cause to blame. There is only the long accumulation of pressures and the quiet point at which they become too many. On a deeper level, there is the question of what it means to share a planet with the ghosts of another intelligent species. Neanderthals were not simple animals. They buried their dead. They cared for their sick. They made art. They likely had language, or something close enough to language that it served the same function. When their line ended, something irreplaceable was lost. Something that had taken hundreds of thousands of years to develop. The fragments of their DNA that we carry are not just biological curiosities. They are the last remnants of a cousin species that once thought its own thoughts, told its own stories, and faced its own nights alone. If their genome is, in some sense, a warning, it is not a warning in any mystical sense. It is a warning in the way that any thorough medical history is a warning. A record of what happens when certain pressures accumulate, a record that we now have the tools to read. And a record that, read honestly, does not tell us what to do, but tells us what is possible. What is, in fact, already been survived by some and not by others. Where does this leave us? In the short term, the AI analyses will continue. More genomes will be sequenced. Older samples will be reanalyzed. The patterns currently being identified will be either reinforced or softened. Some of the more dramatic claims will probably be trimmed back. Others may strengthen. This is how science tends to work. The first round is exciting. The 10th round is where things actually settle. In the longer term, the broader shift, using AI not just to decode extinct species but to understand the pressures they faced, is likely to become a standard tool. The Neanderthals are a test case. The next round will look at Denisovans, at archaic populations in Africa that have only recently been identified, and at the faint genetic traces of ghost lineages whose fossils we have never found and may never find. The deep past is becoming, for the first time, genuinely readable, and the implications for how we understand our own place in that story are only beginning to unfold. There is also a quieter realization sitting inside all of this. For most of history, humans have treated ourselves as the inevitable outcome of evolution, the winners, the species that was always supposed to be here. The Neanderthal record, read through modern tools, is one of many recent findings that complicates that picture. We were not alone. We were not guaranteed. At the time, modern humans first met Neanderthals, somewhere in what is now the Middle East or Western Asia, the future was not written. It was entirely plausible that either species could have disappeared, or that both could have persisted, or that the two could have blended into something neither modern nor archaic. What actually happened, the mostly us and barely them outcome we see today, was one of several possible paths. The DNA evidence is, in its own way, a reminder that history, including biological history, is not a line. It is a branching field of possibilities, and most of the branches do not survive. A species that vanished 40,000 years ago cannot literally leave us a note. But the material they left behind, the DNA they passed forward, and the patterns that modern tools are finally able to see, amount to something that functions very much like one. Whether we choose to read it that way is up to us. What do you think the Neanderthals would want us to know, if we could ask them? Not in words they could not have written. In the record they did leave behind, quietly, across 30,000 generations. Because whatever the answer, the evidence is becoming harder to ignore. The past, it turns out, has always had something to say. We are only now learning how to listen. And the things it is telling us, in this particular moment, are not comfortable. They are not meant to be. They are meant, if the interpretation holds, to be useful. Which is perhaps the most a species can ever really leave behind for the one that comes after it.